There is a small brass lock in a museum in New York. It is not behind glass. It sits on a plain wooden shelf next to a photograph and a folded piece of fabric. Visitors walk past it every day. Most of them do not stop. It is, after all, just a lock. The kind you would find on a garden shed or a warehouse door. Ordinary in every way except one. This lock was removed from a door on the 9th floor of a building in Lower Manhattan. The door it sealed was an exit. Behind that door, on the afternoon of March 25, 1911, 146 people needed to leave a room that was on fire. They could not. The lock held. My name is Blackwell, and I have spent a long time with this lock. Not the physical object, though I have seen it. I have spent time with what it represents. Because this lock did not malfunction. It did not jam. It did not fail. It performed exactly as intended. Someone installed it on that door to keep it shut, and it kept it shut. The people who installed it wanted to save approximately 5 minutes of labor per worker per day. The people on the other side of the door wanted to live. The lock did not care about either. To understand how a small piece of brass became the most important object in the history of American labor, you need to understand the world that produced it. Not the lock, the logic, the arithmetic that made locking human beings inside a building seem like a reasonable business decision. That arithmetic did not begin on the day of the fire. It began decades earlier, in a city that was growing so fast it had stopped asking questions about the cost. New York City at the turn of the 20th century was the engine room of American industry. Between 1880 and 1910, the population of Manhattan nearly doubled. Most of that growth came from immigration. Ships arrived at Ellis Island carrying families from Italy, from Russia, from Poland, from Ireland, from the provinces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They came with almost nothing. What they had was a willingness to work, and New York had work to offer. The garment industry was the largest employer in the city. By 1900, more than 65,000 workers were employed in the production of clothing in Manhattan alone. The majority of them were women. The majority of those women were young. Some were as young as 14. A few were younger than that. The work was straightforward. Fabric arrived in bolts. It was cut into patterns, stitched together on sewing machines, pressed, folded, and shipped. The product that dominated the industry at this particular moment was called a shirtwaist, a women's blouse, fitted at the waist, popular across every class of American society. Department stores could not keep them on the shelves. Demand was enormous, and where there is enormous demand, there is enormous pressure to produce. The Triangle Waist Company occupied the top 3 floors of the Ash Building, a 10-story structure on the corner of Washington Place and Green Street at the edge of Washington Square Park. The building was owned by a man named Joseph Ash. The company was owned by 2 men named Max Blanck and Isaac Harris. Blanck and Harris were immigrants themselves. They had arrived from Russia in the 1880s, built a small garment operation, expanded it again, and by 1908 had become 2 of the wealthiest garment manufacturers in New York. The Triangle Waist Company employed approximately 500 workers at its peak. It occupied floors 8, 9, and 10 of the Ash Building. Floor 8 was the cutting room, where fabric was cut into patterns. Floor 9 was the sewing floor, where rows of women sat at machines, stitching shirtwaists together. Floor 10 held the offices, the showroom, and the finishing operations. The company was profitable. Blanck and Harris were known in the industry for 2 things. The first was the quality of their product. Triangle shirtwaists were well-made garments that sold at premium prices. The second was the efficiency of their operation. And it is here, in the word efficiency, that the lock enters the story. Efficiency in the garment industry of 1910 did not mean better machinery or smarter processes. It meant extracting more minutes from each worker. A 14-hour shift was standard. Breaks were not guaranteed. The doors to the stairwells were locked during working hours. The official reason was theft prevention. Blanck and Harris claimed that workers were smuggling shirtwaists out of the factory under their coats. The solution, they decided, was to funnel every worker through a single exit at the end of each shift, where a guard would inspect their bags and their persons before allowing them to leave. To make this system work, every other exit had to be sealed. There was a second reason, and it was not discussed as openly. Locked doors prevented unauthorized breaks. If a worker could not leave the floor, she could not waste time in the stairwell, could not step outside for air, could not visit a friend on another floor. Every minute a worker was away from her machine was a minute of lost production. Blanck and Harris calculated that locked doors saved approximately 5 to 7 minutes per worker per shift. Multiply that by 500 workers. Multiply that by 6 days a week. The numbers were compelling. There were those who objected. In fact, the objections had been loud, public, and sustained for years before the fire. To understand them, you need to know about a woman named Clara Lemlich. Clara Lemlich was 23 years old in November of 1909 when she stood up at a meeting of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union at Cooper Union Hall, interrupted the scheduled speakers, and called for a general strike. She spoke in Yiddish. She said she was tired of listening to speeches. She wanted action. The next morning, approximately 20,000 garment workers walked off the job. It was the largest strike by women workers in American history up to that point. They called it the Uprising of the 20,000. The strikers had a list of demands: better wages, shorter hours, and one demand that would become relevant 18 months later in a way that no one at the time could have predicted. They demanded unlocked doors. The strike lasted from November 1909 to February 1910. Some manufacturers settled, some did not. Max Blanck and Isaac Harris did not. The Triangle Waist Company was one of the last holdouts. Blanck and Harris hired replacement workers, hired private security, and waited. When the strike ended, their doors remained locked. The union had won concessions from other factories. Triangle was not among them. Clara Lemlich, incidentally, was not a Triangle employee. She worked at a different factory. But she knew the conditions inside Triangle. Everyone in the garment district knew the conditions inside Triangle. The locked doors were not a secret, they were a policy. There is a detail about the Ash building that matters enormously and that is easy to overlook. The building was classified as fireproof, and in a narrow technical sense, this was true. The structure was steel and concrete. The floors would not burn. The walls would not burn. The staircases would not burn. But the contents of the building, the fabric, the tissue paper patterns, the wooden tables, the wicker baskets full of cotton scraps, the oil used to lubricate the sewing machines, none of that was fireproof. The building was a fireproof shell filled with fuel. Fire inspections had been conducted. Reports had been filed. The reports noted the presence of flammable materials. They noted the single exit policy. They noted the locked doors. They recommended changes. The recommendations were not enforced. The inspection system in New York City at the time was understaffed, underfunded, and, in certain documented cases, actively corrupt. An inspector might visit a factory, note a violation, and accept a payment to overlook it. This was not universal, but it was common enough that the word inspection had become, in the garment district, something close to a joke. A man named Arthur McFarlane worked as a fire prevention inspector for the city. In 1909, he submitted a report on conditions in garment factories in the Washington Place area. His report described overcrowding, blocked exits, and accumulations of flammable waste. He recommended mandatory fire drills for all factories above the 6th floor. His report was received by the Bureau of Fire Prevention. It was filed. It was not acted upon. McFarland submitted a second report in 1910. It was also filed. He did not submit a third. The Ash building had a fire escape, one fire escape. It ran down the exterior of the building on the Green Street side. It was a narrow iron structure designed to hold a limited number of people. How limited is a matter of some historical debate, but the engineering consensus is that it was built to accommodate a slow, orderly descent of perhaps 20 to 30 people at a time. The building held more than 500 workers on any given day. There were 2 stairwells, one on the Washington Place side, one on the Green Street side. The Washington Place stairwell door on the 9th floor was the one fitted with the lock. The Green Street stairwell was accessible, but it opened inward, toward the workers, rather than outward, a design that would become relevant when hundreds of people pressed against it simultaneously. There were 4 elevators, 2 on each side of the building. They were small passenger elevators, each with a capacity of approximately 12 people. Under normal conditions, they were more than adequate. Under the conditions that would exist on March 25th, they were not. The morning of March 25th, 1911, was a Saturday. The workday at the Triangle Waste Company ran from 7:45 in the morning until 4:45 in the afternoon, with a 45-minute break at noon. By 4:30 that afternoon, the workers on all 3 floors were preparing to leave. Fabric was being folded, machines were being covered. The 500 or so workers were 15 minutes from the end of their shift. At approximately 4:40 in the afternoon, on the 8th floor, in the cutting room, a fire started. The precise cause was never determined with certainty. The most widely accepted theory is that a match or a cigarette end, discarded or dropped, ignited a bin of fabric scraps beneath one of the cutting tables. Smoking was prohibited on the factory floor. This rule was widely ignored. Bins of scrap fabric sat beneath every cutting table. They were emptied periodically, but not daily. A man named Samuel Bernstein was the production manager on the 8th floor. He was one of the first to see the flames. He grabbed a pail of water that was kept near the cutting tables and threw it on the fire. The water had no effect. The fire was already too large. Bernstein reached for the fire hose on the wall. He turned the valve. Nothing happened. The hose had not been maintained. The valve was rusted shut. Whether it had ever been tested is not recorded. Within 3 minutes of the first flame, the entire southeast corner of the 8th floor was burning. The fire moved through the cutting room with extraordinary speed. The fuel was everywhere. Cotton fabric, tissue paper patterns hanging on lines above the tables, wooden tables soaked with machine oil, wicker baskets, piles of finished shirtwaists. The room was designed to produce clothing. It produced fire just as efficiently. The workers on the 8th floor had options, though none of them were good. The Green Street stairwell was accessible from the 8th floor. Some workers reached it and descended. Others reached the elevators on the Green Street side. Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortillaro, the 2 elevator operators, began making trips. Each trip carried roughly 12 people. Each trip took approximately 1 minute. The math was simple and cruel. 12 people per minute. Hundreds of people on the floor. The freight elevators on the Washington Place side also operated. A man named Joseph Fletcher ran one of them. He made multiple trips, but the 8th floor had one advantage that the 9th floor did not. The 8th floor had time. Not much, perhaps 5 minutes, but 5 minutes was enough for most of the workers on that floor to reach the stairs or the elevators. Of the approximately 250 workers on the 8th floor, the majority survived. The 10th floor, at the top of the building, also had an advantage. Someone on the 8th floor, accounts vary on exactly who, managed to telephone the 10th floor offices before the lines went dead. The message was brief. Fire on 8, get out. The workers on 10 had the additional option of the roof. They climbed the stairs to the roof, where students and faculty from the New York University Law School in the adjacent building helped them cross over. Nearly everyone on the 10th floor survived. The 9th floor received no warning. This is the fact that determines everything that follows. The 8th floor knew because the fire started there. The 10th floor knew because someone called. The 9th floor, the floor with the most workers, the floor with the locked door, the floor where roughly 300 people sat at sewing machines in tight rows, the 9th floor knew nothing until they smelled smoke and saw flames. The fire reached the 9th floor through the windows. Flames climbed the exterior of the building and entered through the open windows on the east side. They also traveled through the elevator shafts and the stairwells, carried by the draft that the building's height created. By the time the workers on 9 understood what was happening, their exits were already compromised. Some ran for the Green Street stairwell. The door opened, but the stairwell was already filling with smoke from the floors below. Those who entered it and kept going downwards survived, though many suffered from the smoke. Those who hesitated, who turned back at the sight of the smoke, returned to the floor. Some ran for the elevators. Zito and Mortillaro were still running their cars. They continued as long as they could. On multiple trips, workers forced the elevator doors open before the car arrived and jumped onto the roof of the descending car. The operators later reported that by the final trips, the cars were carrying not 12, but 25 or 30 people, pressed together so tightly that the doors could barely close. At a certain point, the elevator cables began to stretch under the weight. The cars slowed, then they stopped. The heat had warped the rails. The elevators made no more trips. Some ran for the fire escape, the narrow iron structure on the Green Street side. They climbed out the windows and began to descend. 20 people, 40 people, 60 people. The fire escape was never built for this. The iron twisted under the combined weight. The bolts connecting the structure to the building wall began to pull free. At approximately 4:50, with an unknown number of people on it, the fire escape collapsed. It folded downward like a hinge and deposited everyone on it into the alley below. The fall was nearly 100 feet, and some ran for the Washington Place stairwell door. This was the door with the lock. Dozens of workers pressed against this door. They pushed, they pulled, they pounded on it with their fists. The door did not open. The lock held. It was a simple mechanism, a sliding bolt that could only be opened from the outside or with a key held by a manager. No manager was at the door. The key was not available. The question of whether this door was actually locked on March 25th has been debated for over a century. At the trial that followed, the defense argued that the door was open and that the workers simply did not try it, or tried it incorrectly, or panicked and forgot how doors work. The prosecution argued that it was locked, as it was locked every working day, as a matter of company policy, as confirmed by dozens of surviving workers. What is not debated is this: no one exited through the Washington Place stairwell door on the 9th floor during the fire. Not one person. Whether it was locked by a bolt, or jammed by pressure, or blocked by debris, the result was identical. 300 workers on the 9th floor had one fewer exit than they needed. The fire department arrived quickly. Engine Company 72 was stationed only a few blocks away. They were on the scene within minutes, but they faced a problem that no amount of courage could solve. Their ladders reached to the 6th floor. The fire was on the 8th, 9th, and 10th. Their hose streams reached the 7th floor at most. The pressure was insufficient to push water higher. Captain Howard Rooch of Engine Company 18 ordered his men to raise the longest ladder they had. It reached the 6th floor windows, 60 feet. The workers were at 90 and 100 feet. Captain Rooch stood in the street and looked up at the windows of the 9th floor and understood that he could not reach them. Life nets were deployed. These were circular nets held by teams of firefighters designed to catch a person falling from a moderate height. A 3rd floor, perhaps a 4th. The 9th floor was 90 feet up. The first person who landed in the net broke through it. The nets were not designed for that velocity. The firefighters holding the nets were knocked off their feet. After the 3rd or 4th attempt, the nets were torn and useless. The crowd that had gathered on Washington Place and Green Street numbered in the thousands. Among them was a young woman named Frances Perkins. She was 30 years old, a social worker, a researcher who had spent years documenting labor conditions in New York. She had come to Washington Place because she was having tea with friends at a nearby house when they heard the fire engines. She walked to the corner. She looked up. What Frances Perkins saw from that sidewalk changed the course of American history. She would later say that she could not describe it. She would spend the rest of her life trying. United Press reporter William Gunn Shepard was also in the crowd. He was on the telephone with his editor, dictating what he saw in real time. His account was published that evening. Shepard reported seeing workers at the 9th floor windows. He reported seeing them hesitate. He reported seeing them step onto the window ledges. He reported seeing them hold hands. He reported that they did not scream. He reported that the crowd below did scream. He reported the sound. Shepard would later write that the most terrible thing was the silence from above and the sound from below. The people at the windows made no noise. The people on the sidewalk could not stop. 146 people did not survive the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Of those, 123 were women and girls. 23 were men. The youngest confirmed was 14 years old. The oldest was 43. The majority were between the ages of 16 and 23. Most were Italian or Jewish immigrants. Most had been in America for less than 5 years. Some had been in America for less than 5 months. Identification of the remains took weeks. Families lined up outside a makeshift morgue on the 26th Street Pier on the East River. They filed past rows of simple wooden coffins. Some identified their daughters, their sisters, their wives immediately. Some could not. 6 of the deceased were never identified at all. They were buried together in a single plot at the Evergreen Cemetery in Brooklyn, under a marker provided by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. The fire burned for approximately 30 minutes. The building itself, as predicted by its fireproof classification, did not collapse. The steel stood. The concrete held. The staircases survived. The building was structurally sound. It is still standing today. You can visit it. It is now part of New York University. Students attend classes in the same rooms where 300 women sat at sewing machines on the afternoon of March 25, 1911. There is a plaque on the corner. Most people walk past it. The criminal trial of Max Blanck and Isaac Harris began on December 4, 1911, 9 months after the fire. They were charged with manslaughter. The charge was specific. It alleged that they had locked the Washington Place stairwell door on the 9th floor, and that this locked door directly contributed to the loss of life. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Charles Bostwick. He called more than 100 witnesses. Survivors testified. Firefighters testified. Building inspectors testified. Workers described the locked door. Workers described pounding on it. Workers described turning back from it to look for another way out. Workers described the exact sound of their own hands against the metal. The defense was led by Max Steuer, one of the most celebrated trial lawyers in New York City. Steuer did not argue that the conditions in the factory were acceptable. He did not argue that the fire was unforeseeable. He argued a narrower point. He argued that the prosecution had not proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the specific door on the 9th floor was locked at the specific moment of the fire. He argued that the witnesses were unreliable. He argued that panic had distorted their memories. He argued that the door might have been locked, or it might have been jammed by the pressure of the crowd, or it might have been open and simply overlooked in the confusion. Steuer was particularly effective with one witness, a young woman named Kate Alterman. Alterman had been on the 9th floor. She had survived by following a group to the Green Street stairwell. She gave vivid, detailed testimony about what she had seen. Steuer asked her to repeat her testimony. She did, word for word. Steuer asked her to repeat it again. She did, again, word for word. Steuer turned to the jury and suggested that testimony repeated verbatim 3 times was testimony that had been rehearsed, not remembered. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On December 27, 1911, they returned a verdict of not guilty. Max Blanck and Isaac Harris walked out of the courtroom as free men. The insurance claim was settled the following year. Blanck and Harris had insured the Triangle Waste Company for a sum that exceeded the value of the inventory and equipment lost in the fire. The insurance company paid. The total payout was approximately $60,000 above the documented losses. After all legal fees, after all settlements, after all costs, Blanck and Harris netted a profit on the fire. The families of the deceased filed civil suits. These suits were settled in 1913, more than 2 years after the fire. The settlement amount was $75 per life. $75. That was the number that the legal system of the state of New York assigned to each of the 146 people who did not come home on March 25th. Adjusted for today, it is roughly $2,400. Blanck and Harris received approximately $400 per life from their insurance. They paid $75. The net difference was $325 per deceased worker. This is not interpretation, this is arithmetic. The owners of the Triangle Waste Company made money on every person who perished in their factory. Max Blanck was arrested again in 1913, 2 years after the fire, for locking a door in his new factory. The charge was a misdemeanor. The fine was $20. This is the part of the story where things change. Not because of the trial, not because of the verdict, not because of the fine. Things changed because of the people who stood on the sidewalk. Frances Perkins did not leave Washington Place after the fire. She did not go home. She went to work. Within weeks, she was appointed to the New York State Factory Investigating Commission, alongside a state senator named Robert Wagner and an assemblyman named Alfred Smith. The commission was given broad authority to investigate factory conditions throughout the state. Over the next 4 years, the commission conducted hearings, visited factories, reviewed safety codes, and documented what it found. It found locked doors. It found blocked stairwells. It found fire escapes that led nowhere. It found buildings with no fire escapes at all. It found children operating heavy machinery. It found workdays of 16 hours. It found wages that did not cover the cost of rent in the tenements where the workers lived. It found, in short, a system. The commission produced a series of reports. The reports produced legislation. Between 1911 and 1914, the state of New York passed 36 new laws governing workplace safety. The laws required fire drills. They required unlocked exits during working hours. They required fire escapes that could bear the weight of the building's occupants. They required automatic sprinkler systems in buildings above a certain height. They required adequate lighting. They required sanitary facilities. They required limits on working hours for women and children. 36 laws in 3 years, after decades of inaction. It took 146 deaths to accomplish what decades of organizing, striking, petitioning, and pleading had not. Rose Schneiderman, a labor organizer who had been active in the 1909 strike, spoke at a memorial meeting at the Metropolitan Opera House on April 2, 1911, 8 days after the fire. She addressed an audience of wealthy New Yorkers who had come to express their sympathy and their desire to help. Schneiderman told them that she was not interested in their sympathy. She said that workers had been burned before, and that nobody cared. She said that every week workers were maimed in industrial accidents, and that nobody cared. She said that the only thing the working class had was its own solidarity, because the life of a worker meant nothing to those who profited from it. Schneiderman did not soften her words for the audience. She did not thank them for coming. She told them that their charity was insufficient and that only power, only organization, only the collective force of working people could prevent the next fire. The audience sat in silence. Frances Perkins carried the Triangle Fire with her for the rest of her career. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt appointed her Secretary of Labor. She was the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet in American history. In that role, she oversaw the creation of Social Security, the establishment of the minimum wage, the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the framework for unemployment insurance. When asked, years later, what had driven her life's work, she said it was the Triangle Fire. She said the New Deal began on March 25, 1911. Al Smith, the assemblyman who had served on the Factory Investigating Commission, later became governor of New York. Robert Wagner, the state senator, later became a United States senator and authored the National Labor Relations Act, which guaranteed the right of workers to organize and bargain collectively. Both men, when asked about the origins of their commitment to labor reform, pointed to the same event. One fire, one afternoon, and the entire architecture of American labor protection shifted. But here is the part that Blackwell cannot leave alone, the part that keeps the lock relevant. On April 24, 2013, 102 years after the Triangle Fire, a building collapsed in Savar, Bangladesh. The building was called Rana Plaza. It housed 5 garment factories. The factories produced clothing for retailers in Europe and North America. The building had been inspected the day before the collapse. Cracks had been found in the structural columns. The inspectors recommended evacuation. The factory owners told the workers to return to their shifts the following morning. The workers returned. The building collapsed. 1,134 people perished. The workers at Rana Plaza were mostly women. They were mostly young. They earned approximately $38 per month. The clothing they produced sold in Western department stores for prices that would have represented several months of their wages. The exit doors at Rana Plaza were not locked with brass padlocks. The technology had changed. The arithmetic had not. Rana Plaza was not an aberration. It was not an anomaly. It was a data point in a pattern that has been running for more than a century. The same pattern, different geography, different names. Same locked doors, whether the lock is made of brass or made of economic coercion. Same calculation, what does it cost to make the building safe, and what does it cost to not make it safe, and which number is smaller? In Karachi, Pakistan, in September of 2012, a fire at the Ali Enterprises garment factory took the lives of 255 workers. The exits were locked. In Dhaka, Bangladesh, in November of 2012, a fire at the Tazreen fashion factory took the lives of 112 workers. The managers told the workers to stay at their machines. The fire alarms, they said, were false alarms. They were not false alarms. 3 factories, 3 countries, 3 fires, 1 pattern. The pattern does not require a century to repeat. It does not require a decade. Sometimes it requires only a month. I need to trace the line further, because the pattern is not confined to garment factories. It is not confined to any single industry. It is a universal principle, and the principle is this: when the cost of safety exceeds the cost of consequence, safety loses. Every time, without exception, until the consequence arrives. This is not cynicism, this is accounting. And I say that not as an insult to accountants, but as a description of a system that operates on numbers. The system does not hate workers. The system does not love workers. The system counts. And when the system counts, it discovers that a brass lock costs 11 cents, and a fire drill costs 45 minutes of lost production across 500 workers, and a sprinkler system costs several $1,000s, and the fine for a locked door, if a fine comes at all, costs $20. The system does not need to be malicious. It only needs to be consistent. And it is remarkably, relentlessly, historically consistent. Let me take you back to the Ash Building for a moment, because there is a detail I have not yet mentioned, and it is a detail that illuminates the entire structure of this story. The Ash Building was 10 stories tall. The fire code in New York City in 1911 required fire escapes for buildings over 6 stories. The Ash Building had 1 fire escape. 1. For a 10-story building that held more than 500 workers. This single fire escape was not a violation of the code. The code required 1 fire escape. The building had 1 fire escape. The code was satisfied. The code was not interested in whether 1 fire escape was sufficient for 500 people. The code counted fire escapes, not people. Joseph Ash, the building's owner, was never charged with any crime. He had built his building to code. The code was inadequate, but that was not his problem. He had followed the law. The law was insufficient, but he had followed it. This distinction between what is legal and what is safe is the fissure through which 146 people fell. The building code was not written by the workers who occupied the buildings. It was written by the people who built and owned them. The people who wrote the code had a financial interest in keeping the code minimal. Every additional requirement, wider stairwells, more fire escapes, automatic sprinklers, was an additional cost, and costs were subtracted from profits, and profits with a purpose. I want you to hold 2 numbers in your mind simultaneously. The first number is 146. That is the number of people who did not survive the Triangle Fire. The second number is 325. That is the net profit in dollars that Max Blanck and Isaac Harris made on each of those lives through the difference between their insurance payout and the civil settlement. 146 times 325 is $47,450. That was the profit, not the cost, the profit. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was, for its owners, a profitable event. I need you to stay with that for a moment, not because it is shocking, though it is, but because it reveals the internal logic of the system in its purest form. If a disaster is profitable, the system has no incentive to prevent it. The incentive runs in the other direction. The incentive is to allow the conditions that produce disasters, insure against the consequences, and collect when the consequences arrive. Blanck and Harris did not set the fire. There is no evidence of arson. But they created the conditions under which a small fire became an inescapable one. They locked the doors. They failed to maintain the fire hoses. They allowed flammable materials to accumulate. They resisted the union's demand for unlocked exits. They calculated the cost of each safety measure against the cost of ignoring it, and they chose to ignore it. And when the fire came, the arithmetic worked in their favor. This is not a story about two bad men. Max Blanck was not a villain in a melodrama. Isaac Harris was not twirling a moustache. They were businessmen, operating within a system that rewarded the exact behavior they exhibited. The system did not punish them. The jury did not convict them. The insurance company paid them. The civil courts assigned a value of $75 per life and called the matter settled. Every signal the system sent told Blanck and Harris that they had made the correct decisions. And this is why Blanck was caught locking a door again 2 years later. Because the system had confirmed his arithmetic. $20 for a locked door, 5 minutes of saved labor per worker per shift. The numbers still worked. The lock was still cheaper than the alternative. Let me tell you about the people behind the numbers. Because the numbers are easy to say and impossible to feel, and this story requires feeling. There was a young woman named Rosaria Maltese. She was 14 years old. She worked on the 9th floor with her mother, Catherine, who was 39, and her sister, Lucia, who was 20. All three were at their sewing machines when the fire reached the 9th floor. All three attempted to reach the Green Street stairwell. Catherine Maltese survived. She made it down the stairs through the smoke. When she reached the street, she turned around and waited for her daughters. They did not come. There was a man named Dominic Cardian. He was not a Triangle employee. He was a passerby, a bricklayer walking home from a job site. He was on Washington Place when the fire engines arrived. He looked up. He saw a young woman on a 9th floor ledge. He began to climb the facade of the building. Firefighters pulled him down. He fought them. They held him. The woman on the ledge was not identified. There were 2 young women named Ida Brodsky and Becky Kessler. They were both 17. They were best friends. They worked side by side on the 9th floor. They were found together. There was a man named Isidore Abramovitz. He was a cutter on the 8th floor. When the fire started, he did not run for the exits. He ran to the 9th floor to warn the workers there. He made it to the 9th floor. He made it to the sewing room. He shouted, "Fire!" Then the smoke took him. He did not make it back down. There was a young woman named Jenny Stellino. She was 16. She had been working at Triangle for 2 months. Her family had arrived from Sicily the previous year. Her father, a tailor, had found her the position at Triangle because the wages were better than at the smaller shops. He walked her to the building every morning. He was waiting for her on the sidewalk when the fire started. There was a young woman named Celia Walker. She was 17. She had been due to leave Triangle the following week. She had found a position at a better factory, one where the doors were not locked. Her last day at Triangle was supposed to be March 31st. She was 6 days from freedom. These are names. They are specific. They belong to real people who lived real lives that ended in a real building on a real afternoon. I name them because the system did not. The system counted them. The system priced them. The system settled their accounts at $75 each and moved on. The system always moves on. The people do not. Catherine Maltese, who survived the fire but lost both her daughters, never worked in a factory again. She lived until 1943. Neighbors who knew her said she did not speak about the fire. She did not speak about much of anything. She attended the memorial services every year. She stood in the crowd. She did not address the gatherings. She had said everything she needed to say on the afternoon of March 25, 1911, when she stood on the sidewalk on Green Street and called her daughters' names into the smoke. The memorial services, incidentally, have never stopped. Every year on March 25th, a ceremony is held at the site of the fire. The names of the 146 are read aloud. For each name, a bell is struck. The ceremony takes approximately 45 minutes. It has been held every year since 1911. More than 113 years of bells. Let me tell you about what came after. Not the laws which I have described, not the commission which I have described. Let me tell you about the world that the Triangle Fire built. Frances Perkins became the architect of the American social safety net. This is not hyperbole. The programs she created or championed, Social Security, unemployment insurance, the minimum wage, the 40-hour work week, the prohibition of child labor in interstate commerce, these are the foundations of the modern American labor system. Every paycheck that lists a Social Security deduction carries, at several removes, the fingerprint of the Triangle Fire. Perkins was asked once by a journalist how she had sustained her commitment through decades of political opposition, bureaucratic resistance, and personal attack. She said she thought about the girls on the 9th floor. She said she thought about the door that did not open. She said that every time someone told her that a safety regulation was too expensive, or too burdensome, or too disruptive to business, she thought about the lock. The lock. Always the lock. The small brass lock that cost 11 cents and saved 5 minutes per worker per shift, and held a door shut while the room behind it filled with fire. Robert Wagner, the state senator who had served on the Factory Investigating Commission, went on to the United States Senate, where he authored the Wagner Act of 1935, formerly known as the National Labor Relations Act. This law established the legal right of workers to form unions, to bargain collectively, and to strike. It created the National Labor Relations Board. It is, by many measures, the single most important piece of labor legislation in American history. Wagner was asked, in testimony before Congress, why he believed so strongly in the right of workers to organize. He said that he had seen what happened when workers could not organize. He said he had seen the consequences on March 25, 1911. He said the Triangle workers had tried to organize. They had struck in 1909. They had demanded unlocked doors. The company had refused. The workers had no legal mechanism to force the issue, and so the doors remained locked. The Wagner Act was, in a direct and traceable way, a response to that lock. Al Smith became governor of New York and ran for president in 1928. He lost, but his influence on New York state labor law was permanent. The factory codes that his commission produced became the template for labor regulations nationwide. Other states adopted them. The federal government drew from them. The Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, which created OSHA, is a direct descendant of the New York State Factory Code of 1913, which is a direct descendant of the Triangle Fire. One lock, one fire, one afternoon, and the reverberations have not stopped. There is a tendency, when telling stories like this one, to end with the legislation. To say, the fire was terrible, but it led to reform, and the reform made things better, and therefore the story has a redemptive arc. This is comforting. It is also incomplete, because the reforms were not universal. They were not permanent. They were not immune to revision. Every law that was passed in the wake of the Triangle Fire has been challenged, weakened, defunded, or ignored at some point in the century that followed. OSHA, which exists because of the Triangle Fire, has never had a budget sufficient to inspect every workplace in America. At current staffing levels, it would take OSHA inspectors approximately 165 years to visit every workplace under their jurisdiction once. Not annually, once. The fire escapes that were mandated after the Triangle Fire are still failing. In 2018, a fire escape collapsed in a residential building in New York City. The design was nearly identical to the one on the Ash building. The escape had not been inspected in over a decade. The building owner was fined. The fine was less than the cost of the repair that would have prevented the collapse. The locked doors are still locked, not always with brass padlocks, sometimes with electronic locks controlled by managers. sometimes with security protocols that require badge access to exit, sometimes with the simple economic lock of a job that a worker cannot afford to lose. In 2016, a poultry processing plant in the American South was found to have locked its exit doors during working hours. The reason given by the plant manager was identical to the reason given by Blanck and Harris in 1911. To prevent theft. Workers at the plant reported that they had complained about the locked doors. They reported that their complaints had been ignored. They reported that they continued to work behind locked doors because they needed the wages. They reported that they understood the risk and accepted it because the alternative, unemployment, was worse. The fine for the locked doors at the poultry plant was several $1,000s. The plant's annual revenue was in the hundreds of millions. The fine was a rounding error. The doors were unlocked for the duration of the inspection. Whether they remained unlocked after the inspectors left is a question that the inspection system is not designed to answer. I want to return now to something I said at the beginning. I said there is a small brass lock in a museum in New York. This is true. The lock is in the collection of the New York City Fire Museum on Spring Street in Manhattan. It is not a large museum. It occupies a former firehouse. The collection includes apparatus, helmets, photographs, and artifacts from major fires in the city's history. The triangle lock is not the centerpiece of any exhibition. It sits among other objects from the fire: a damaged sewing machine shuttle, a fragment of charred fabric, a photograph of the building taken the day after the fire with the windows blown out and the fire escape hanging like a broken arm from the facade. I have stood in front of that lock. I have looked at it closely. It is unremarkable. It is a standard brass padlock of the type manufactured by the thousands in the early 20th century. The keyhole is small. The shackle is thick relative to the size of the body. It is the kind of lock designed for security, for holding fast, for not opening when someone wants it to open. It did its job perfectly, and that is the horror of it. Not that the lock failed, not that the lock malfunctioned. The horror is that the lock worked. It was placed on a door to keep that door shut, and it kept that door shut. The people who placed it there wanted to control when workers could leave, and it controlled when workers could leave. On March 25th, it controlled when workers could leave during a fire, and the answer was, they could not. The lock did not distinguish between an ordinary Tuesday and the worst Saturday in the history of American labor. It did not know the difference. It was a lock. It held the door shut on days when holding the door shut meant saving 5 minutes of labor. And it held the door shut on the day when holding the door shut meant something else entirely. It was consistent. It was reliable. It was exactly what its owners wanted it to be. Every system that prioritizes control over safety contains this lock. Every policy that restricts exit in the name of efficiency contains this lock. Every building code that counts fire escapes instead of people contains this lock. Every inspection regime that lacks the funding to inspect contains this lock. Every fine that costs less than the violation it punishes contains this lock. Every insurance policy that pays more for a disaster than prevention would have cost contains this lock. The lock is not an artifact. The lock is a principle, and the principle is still in operation. I want to tell you one more story. It is a small story, and it comes from the trial. During the prosecution's case, a young woman named Ethel Monick was called to testify. Monick had worked on the 9th floor. She was 16 years old at the time of the fire. She survived by reaching the Green Street stairwell, though she was burned on her arms and face. The prosecutor asked Monick to describe the moment she realized the building was on fire. She said she smelled something burning. She said she looked up from her machine and saw smoke coming through the floorboards. She said she stood up. She said the girl next to her stood up. She said everyone stood up at the same time, like a wave. The prosecutor asked her what happened next. She said everyone ran. She said they ran in every direction. She said some ran to the elevators, some ran to the windows, some ran to the Green Street stairwell, some ran to the Washington Place door. The prosecutor asked her about the Washington Place door. She said she did not go to that door. She said she knew it was locked. She said everyone knew it was locked. She said it was always locked. She said she did not try it because there was no point in trying a door that was always locked. The defense attorney, Max Steuer, asked Monique on cross-examination how she knew the door was locked if she did not try it. Monique said she knew because it was always locked. Steuer said that was not the same as knowing it was locked on that particular day. Monique said that when a door is locked every day for months, you stop trying it. Steuer said that was an assumption, not a fact. Monique said that walking past a locked door every day for months was a fact. The lock was a fact. The policy was a fact. The only thing that was not a fact, she said, was whether the owners would have unlocked it in time. The judge instructed the jury to disregard Monique's last statement. The jury heard it anyway. The jury acquitted Blanck and Harris. They acquitted them because the prosecution could not prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the specific door was locked at the specific moment. The lock might have been open. The lock might have been closed. The lock might have been engaged. The lock might have been released. No one could say with certainty because the people who would have known with certainty were on the wrong side of the door. This is the final cruelty of the locked door. The people who could testify to its being locked were the people who could not get through it. And the people who could not get through it could not testify. The lock keeps its own secret. The dead keep the lock's secret, and the living collect the insurance. Max Blanck continued in the garment business until his death in 1947. Isaac Harris continued in the garment business until his death in 1954. Neither man served a day in prison. Neither man paid a meaningful financial penalty. Neither man expressed public remorse. Both men were, by every measure that their society valued, successful. They died in their beds. The workers of the Triangle Waste Company did not die in their beds. There is a memorial at the site of the fire now. It was dedicated in 2011, on the 100th anniversary. It is a steel ribbon that wraps around the corner of the building, following the roofline of the old ash building. Etched into the steel are the names and ages of the 146. The memorial is subtle. You have to look for it. It does not announce itself. It simply waits for someone to notice. Below the memorial, on the sidewalk at the corner of Washington Place and Green Street, there are small brass plaques set into the concrete. Each plaque marks the home address of a worker who perished in the fire. The addresses fan out from the building across the Lower East Side, across the East Village, across Brooklyn, across the Bronx. If you were to walk from plaque to plaque, you would walk through the neighborhoods where these workers lived. You would walk past the tenements where they slept, the synagogues and churches where they prayed, the markets where they bought bread. You would walk through a city that has changed almost beyond recognition and find, set into the sidewalk, a name and an address, and a reminder that someone once walked the same streets you are walking, on her way to a job that would not let her leave. I began this story with a lock. I want to end it with a door. Not the Washington Place door, a different door. The door to the Factory Investigating Commission in Albany, New York, in the fall of 1911. This door was open. It was open because Frances Perkins opened it. She opened it because she had seen what happened when doors were closed. She opened it and she kept it open for 4 years while the commission did its work. She opened it and she kept it open for the rest of her career, through the Department of Labor, through the New Deal, through 2 world wars and a depression, and the complete transformation of American labor law. She opened one door because another door had been locked. This is the only redemption the story offers, and it is an imperfect one. The door that Frances Perkins opened did not bring back the 146. It did not bring back Rosaria Maltese, or Lucia Maltese, or Celia Walker, or Jenny Stellino, or any of the 6 who were never identified at all. It did not undo the lock. It did not reverse the fire. It did not punish the men who calculated human life in increments of 5 minutes. What it did was establish a principle. The principle is simple, and it should not have required 146 deaths to establish, but it did. The principle is this: the door must open from the inside. Not because the building inspector says so, not because the fire code requires it, not because the union demands it. The door must open from the inside because the people on the inside are people, and people must be able to leave a room when the room is on fire. This is not a complicated principle. A child could understand it. Max Blanck could understand it. Isaac Harris could understand it. They understood it, and they chose the lock anyway, because the lock saved 5 minutes per worker per shift, and the principle saved nothing that could be measured in dollars. The principle is still being contested, right now, today. In factories and warehouses and processing plants and office buildings and fulfillment centers around the world, the principle is being weighed against the cost of its implementation. And in some of those buildings, the cost is winning. The lock is still there. It is sitting on a shelf in a museum on Spring Street in Manhattan. It is not behind glass. You can see the patina on the brass. You can see where the key once entered. You can see the mechanism that held the shackle in place. It is small. It is ordinary. It is the most dangerous object in the room. Somewhere in the world right now, someone is calculating the cost of unlocking a door. They are weighing the minutes lost against the liability assumed. They are running the numbers. They are looking at the spreadsheet. They are making a decision. The arithmetic has not changed. The brass has been replaced by steel, and the steel has been replaced by software, and the software has been replaced by policy. But the arithmetic is the same arithmetic that Max Blanck used in 1911. Profit is calculated in minutes. Tragedy is calculated in lives. And the distance between the two is the width of a door that opens or does not open from the inside. My name is Blackwell. The lock is still there, and so is the arithmetic. If you are standing in a building right now, look at the nearest exit. Look at the door. Look at how it opens. Does it open from the inside? Can you reach it? Is the path clear? 146 people would want you to check. Now, about locked rooms. We have talked about a room locked by brass and greed, a room where the lock was physical and the motive was 5 minutes of labor. Next time, we will talk about a different kind of locked room, a room where the lock was chemical and the motive was health. A medicine that promised to cure everything. A medicine that was sold in every pharmacy in the Western world. A medicine that glowed in the dark. And a room full of women who painted it onto watch dials with brushes they sharpened with their lips. Locked in a room or locked in a glowing death. Next, the medicine that cured everything and ended everyone. There is something else I need to tell you about the Ash Building. Something about the geography of the place that most accounts leave out. The building sits at the edge of Washington Square Park. On the afternoon of March 25, 1911, it was a Saturday in early spring. The trees in the park were just beginning to show their first green. Families were walking. Children were playing. Street vendors were selling roasted chestnuts and hot pretzels. The park is bordered by some of the finest townhouses in Manhattan. Washington Square North, sometimes called the Row, was home to wealthy families who had lived there for generations. These were not tenement dwellers. These were not garment workers. These were the people who wore the shirtwaists that the Triangle workers produced. They sat in their parlors and heard the fire engines. They walked to their windows and saw the smoke. They stepped outside and joined the crowd. And so the two New Yorks met on that sidewalk. The New York that produced the clothing and the New York that purchased it. The New York that locked the doors and the New York that did not know the doors were locked. They stood side by side on Washington Place and looked up at the same windows. This proximity is not incidental. It is central to why the Triangle Fire, unlike the dozens of factory fires that preceded it, became a transformative event. Previous fires had occurred in neighborhoods that wealthy New Yorkers never visited. They had occurred in buildings that wealthy New Yorkers never saw. The workers who perished in those fires were invisible in life and invisible in death. Their stories appeared in the back pages of newspapers, if they appeared at all. The Triangle Fire happened in the middle of the city. It happened next to a park. It happened in front of thousands of witnesses who had the social standing, the education, the connections, and the outrage to demand that something be done. Frances Perkins was having tea in a townhouse on the north side of the park. She was not a garment worker. She was a graduate of Mount Holyoke College with a master's degree from Columbia University. She was a professional reformer with access to politicians, journalists, and philanthropists. She was exactly the kind of person who could turn outrage into policy. If the Triangle Fire had occurred 10 blocks further south, in the heart of the garment district, away from the park and the townhouses and the university, it is possible, not certain but possible, that the political response would have been smaller, slower, less decisive. The fire mattered because of who saw it, and who saw it was determined by where it happened, and where it happened was determined by real estate prices, which placed a profitable factory at the edge of a fashionable park, which placed the workers within sight of the people who had the power to change things. Geography is not justice, but sometimes geography is the mechanism through which justice arrives. There is another dimension to this story that requires attention, and it is the dimension of identity. The workers of the Triangle Waste Company were overwhelmingly immigrants. They were Italian and Jewish, from southern Italy and from the Russian Empire. In the social hierarchy of New York in 1911, these were not favored groups. Italians faced discrimination in housing, employment, and education. Jewish immigrants faced similar barriers, compounded by anti-Semitism that was both casual and institutional. The workers at Triangle occupied the lowest rung of the economic ladder. They were poor. They were foreign. They spoke English imperfectly or not at all. Many of the youngest workers could not read in any language. They had no political power, no social connections, no access to the legal system. They had their labor, and they had each other, and they had the union, which was itself young and underfunded and fighting for recognition. When Clara Lemlich called for the general strike in 1909, she spoke in Yiddish because many of the workers did not speak English. When the strike spread, the picket signs were written in Italian, in Yiddish, in Russian, in English. The workers could not always communicate with each other, but they could communicate one thing clearly. They wanted the doors unlocked. Max Blanck and Isaac Harris were also immigrants. They were also Jewish. They had also arrived from the Russian Empire with almost nothing. They had built their fortune through the same garment industry that employed their workers. The difference between them and their workers was not origin. It was time. Blanck and Harris had arrived earlier. They had accumulated capital. They had crossed the line from labor to management, from worker to owner, from the sewing machine to the executive office on the 10th floor. They had made the crossing, and once across, they had adopted the logic of the other side. This is a pattern that appears throughout the history of labor exploitation. The exploiter and the exploited often share a common background. They speak the same language. They attend the same houses of worship. They come from the same villages. The difference is positional, not essential. It is the difference between the person who holds the key and the person who needs the door to open. Blanck and Harris did not exploit their workers because they were different from them. They exploited their workers because the system rewarded exploitation regardless of who performed it. An Italian factory owner would have locked the same doors. An Irish factory owner would have locked the same doors. The lock does not check the nationality of the hand that turns the key. After the fire, both the Italian and Jewish communities in New York mobilized. Funeral processions wound through the streets of the Lower East Side. Synagogues held memorial services. Catholic churches held memorial services. The Jewish Daily Forward, the most widely read Yiddish newspaper in America, published the names and photographs of the deceased. The Italian-language newspapers did the same. The grief crossed every division within the immigrant community and united it in a single demand: never again. Never again. The phrase would take on a different and more terrible meaning 3 decades later. But in 1911, in New York, it meant this: never again would workers be locked inside a building. Never again would fire escapes collapse. Never again would the exit doors be sealed for the convenience of the owners. Never again would the life of a worker be valued at $75. These were promises. Some of them were kept. Some of them were not. Let me tell you about the insurance. Because the insurance is the part of the story that reveals the system most completely. Blanck and Harris carried fire insurance on the Triangle Waste Company. This was not unusual. Most businesses carried fire insurance. What was unusual was the amount. Blanck and Harris had insured their business for a sum that exceeded its actual value. The policies covered not only the equipment and inventory destroyed in the fire, but also the lost business income during the period of rebuilding. When the claims were filed, the insurance company investigated. Insurance investigators examined the ruins of the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. They catalogued the sewing machines, the cutting tables, the inventory of finished and unfinished shirtwaists. They calculated the value of the property destroyed, and they discovered a discrepancy. The insured value was substantially higher than the actual value. This discrepancy raised the possibility of insurance fraud. If Blanck and Harris had deliberately over-insured their business, they stood to profit from any loss. The greater the loss, the greater the profit. This was a known pattern in the garment industry. Factory fires were not uncommon, and some of them were suspicious. The insurance industry had a term for it, and the term was common enough that it required no explanation in the trade. No charge of insurance fraud was ever brought against Blanck and Harris. The insurance company paid the claim. The total payout, as I mentioned, exceeded the actual losses by approximately $60,000. After deducting the civil settlements, $75 per life, times 146 lives, for a total of $10,950, Blanck and Harris retained approximately $49,000 in net excess, plus the ongoing profits of their reorganized business, which resumed operations in a new location within months. The insurance system, like the fire code and the inspection system and the criminal justice system, performed exactly as designed. It transferred risk. It compensated loss. It did not distinguish between a loss caused by negligence and a loss caused by bad luck. It did not ask why the doors were locked. It did not ask why the fire hoses were inoperable. It did not ask why the fire escape collapsed. It asked how much the policy was worth, and it paid that amount. The insurance system was not broken. The insurance system was working perfectly. And that is the most damning thing I can say about it. Let me tell you about one more person, a man named Edward Croker. Croker was the chief of the New York City Fire Department at the time of the Triangle Fire. He had served in the department for more than 3 decades. He had fought fires in tenements, in warehouses, in factories, in hotels. He had seen everything that fire could do. After the Triangle Fire, Croker was asked by a reporter what could be done to prevent similar disasters. Croker said that the answer was simple. He said you did not need new technology or new equipment or new strategies. He said you needed one thing. He said you needed the doors to be unlocked. The reporter asked if that was really all it took. Croker said yes. He said the building was fireproof. He said the stairs were intact. He said the stairwells were passable. He said if the doors had been open, the workers could have walked down the stairs and out of the building and gone home for dinner. He said the fire did not have to become a catastrophe. He said the lock made it a catastrophe. Croker retired from the fire department shortly after the Triangle Fire. He said the job had worn him out. He said he was tired of arriving at buildings where the exits were blocked and the people inside could not get out. He said he was tired of watching people perish because someone had decided that a locked door was worth more than a human life. Croker died in 1922. His obituary mentioned the Triangle Fire. It mentioned his statement about the doors. It did not mention the lock. The lock was too small for an obituary. It is too small for most things. It sits on a shelf in a museum, and it holds the entire story inside its mechanism. And most people walk past it without stopping. I want to talk about one final concept before I close this account. The concept is called the regulatory ratchet. It describes a pattern in which safety regulations are tightened after a disaster, then gradually loosened as the memory of the disaster fades, then tightened again after the next disaster. The ratchet turns one direction, then slips backward, then turns again. Each turn is purchased with lives. The Triangle Fire turned the ratchet. 36 new laws in 3 years. Fire drills, unlocked doors, sprinkler systems, wider stairwells, more fire escapes. The laws were effective. The rate of factory fire fatalities in New York State dropped dramatically in the years following their passage. But the ratchet began to slip almost immediately. Enforcement required funding. Funding required political will. Political will required public attention. Public attention required disaster. In the absence of disaster, attention wandered. Funding shrank, enforcement weakened, and the conditions that produced the disaster began to reassemble themselves. By the 1920s, inspections had become less frequent. By the 1930s, the Depression had shifted political attention to unemployment and banking reform. The factory codes remained on the books, but the inspectors who enforced them were laid off, reassigned, or simply not replaced when they retired. The ratchet slipped. It turned again in 1942, when a fire at the Coconut Grove nightclub in Boston took the lives of 492 people. The exits were blocked. The doors opened inward instead of outward. The building had no sprinkler system. The fire code was updated. The ratchet turned. Then it slipped. It turned again in 1958, when a fire at Our Lady of the Angels School in Chicago took the lives of 92 children and 3 nuns. The school had no fire alarm. The school had one fire escape. The fire code was updated. The ratchet turned. Then it slipped. It turned again in 1970, when the Occupational Safety and Health Act was signed into law, creating OSHA. The act was prompted not by a single disaster, but by an accumulation of them: factory fires, mine collapses, chemical exposures, construction accidents. The ratchet turned, then it slipped. It slipped in the 1980s when the Reagan administration cut OSHA's budget by 25% and reduced the number of workplace inspectors by 20%. It slipped further in the 1990s. It slipped further in the 2000s. Each slip was accompanied by the same argument. Regulation is expensive. Regulation is burdensome. Regulation slows economic growth. Regulation is unnecessary because the market will self-correct. The market does self-correct. It self-corrects after the fire, after the collapse, after the bodies are counted. The market is very efficient at self-correcting after the fact. It is remarkably inefficient at self-correcting before the fact. Because before the fact, the correction is a cost, and after the fact, the correction is a necessity. The market responds to necessity. It does not respond to possibility. The Triangle Fire was a possibility on March 24, 1911. It was a necessity on March 26th. On March 24th, it was a cost to be avoided. On March 26th, it was a catastrophe to be addressed. Nothing changed about the building between those 2 days. Nothing changed about the lock. Nothing changed about the fabric scraps, or the fire hoses, or the fire escapes. The only thing that changed was that 146 people were no longer alive. That is the cost of the ratchet, the cost of waiting for the disaster before addressing the conditions that produced the disaster. The cost is not measured in dollars, it is measured in names. Rosaria Maltese, Lucia Maltese, Celia Walker, Jenny Stellino, Ida Brodsky, Becky Kessler, and 140 more. I have spent a considerable time in the archives of the Triangle Fire, court transcripts, newspaper accounts, insurance records, immigration records, census records, union records. I have read the testimony of survivors. I have read the testimony of firefighters. I have read the testimony of bystanders. I have read the medical examiner's reports to the extent that they are available. I have read the building inspection records. I have read the insurance adjuster's notes. I have read letters written by family members to the city government, asking for information about their daughters, their sisters, their mothers. One letter stays with me. It was written by a man named Giovanni Maltese, the father of Rosaria and the husband of Catherine. He wrote to the city coroner's office in April of 1911, 3 weeks after the fire. He wrote in Italian. Someone at the coroner's office translated it. The translation is imperfect, but the meaning is clear. Giovanni Maltese wrote that he had 2 daughters who worked at the Triangle factory. He wrote that his wife also worked there. He wrote that his wife had survived, but his daughters had not. He wrote that he had been to the morgue on the 26th Street Pier. He wrote that he had identified his daughter Lucia. He wrote that he had not been able to find his daughter Rosaria. He wrote that he needed to find her. He wrote that he could not bury one daughter without the other. He wrote that he needed someone to help him. The coroner's office wrote back. The letter was brief. It informed Giovanni Maltese that his daughter Rosaria had been identified and that her remains were available for release. It provided the hours during which the morgue was open. It expressed condolences. The exchange consists of 2 pieces of paper, a father's desperate letter and a bureaucratic reply. The distance between them is the distance between grief and procedure, between a man who has lost his children and a system that processes the lost. I have held these letters, not the originals, which are in the archives of the New York City Municipal Records, but reproductions, good reproductions, on the same weight of paper, with the same fold marks. The father's handwriting is careful. Each letter is formed deliberately, as if the act of writing required all of his concentration. The bureaucratic reply is typewritten. It took someone approximately 90 seconds to produce. This is what I mean when I say the system moves on. The system types its reply and files its copy and opens the next letter. The father does not move on. The father carries the weight of those 2 names for the rest of his life. Giovanni Maltese lived until 1938. He is buried in Calvary Cemetery in Queens. His daughters are buried in the same cemetery, in a different section. I do not know if the family ever brought them together. The cemetery records do not indicate a transfer. They may still be in separate ground, the father in one place, the daughters in another, separated in death as they were separated by the fire. I mention this because it is specific, because specificity is the antidote to abstraction. 146 is a number. Giovanni Maltese is a father. Rosaria Maltese is a girl who was 14 years old and who went to work on a Saturday morning and did not come home. The number tells you the scale. The name tells you the cost. There is a concept in disaster studies called normalization of deviance. It was coined by a sociologist named Diane Vaughan in her study of the Challenger space shuttle disaster. But it applies with equal force to the Triangle Fire and to every workplace disaster before and since. Normalization of deviance describes the process by which an organization gradually comes to accept abnormal conditions as normal. A door is locked one day. Nothing bad happens. The door is locked the next day. Nothing bad happens. The door is locked every day for a year. Nothing bad happens. The locked door becomes normal. It becomes part of the routine. It becomes invisible. Workers walk past it every day and do not see it because it has always been there. Managers maintain it every day and do not question it because it has always been their policy. Ethel Monick, the 16-year-old witness, described this process perfectly when she said that she did not try the Washington Place door because it was always locked. She had normalized the deviance. She had accepted the locked door as a feature of her working environment. She had incorporated it into her mental map of the building. The locked door was not an emergency, it was a fact. And then the emergency arrived, and the fact became fatal. This is the mechanism by which most workplace disasters occur, not through sudden dramatic failures, but through the slow accumulation of accepted risks. Each individual risk is small: a locked door, an unmaintained fire hose, an overcrowded floor, a fire escape designed for 20 people in a building that holds 500. Each individual risk is tolerable. Each individual risk is normalized, and then the risks combine, and the combination is not tolerable, and people die, and everyone says they could not have predicted it. And the truth is that they could have predicted it if they had looked at the accumulation instead of the individual risks. Blanck and Harris did not decide on March 25th to create a death trap. They decided on hundreds of ordinary days to lock a door, to skip a fire drill, to delay a hose inspection, to ignore a building inspector's recommendation, to resist a union demand. Each decision was small. Each decision was rational within the logic of their accounting. Each decision was a brick in a wall that eventually sealed their workers inside. The fire was not the cause. The fire was the catalyst. The cause was the wall, and the wall was built one brick at a time over months and years by people who were not thinking about fire. They were thinking about minutes, about 5 minutes per worker per shift, about the cost of a sprinkler system versus the cost of insurance, about the price of compliance versus the price of resistance. The price of compliance would have been a few $1,000s. New fire hoses, unlocked doors, a second fire escape, regular drills. Blanck and Harris chose not to pay this price because the system did not require them to pay it. The building code was minimal. The inspections were infrequent. The fines were trivial. The insurance was generous. Every incentive pointed in the same direction, toward the lock. I want to be precise about what changed after the Triangle Fire and what did not. What changed? The laws of New York State, the building codes, the fire codes, the labor codes, the inspection regime, the political careers of Francis Perkins, Robert Wagner, Al Smith, the direction of American labor policy for the next half-century, the existence of Social Security, the minimum wage, unemployment insurance, the 40-hour work week, the right to collective bargaining. All of these can be traced, through documented legislative and political history, to the Triangle Fire and its aftermath. What did not change? The arithmetic. The fundamental calculation that Blanck and Harris performed, is safety cheaper than risk, remains the calculation that every business performs every day. The numbers have changed. The regulations have raised the cost of non-compliance. The penalties have increased, in some jurisdictions, to levels that actually deter. The insurance industry has become more sophisticated in its assessment of risk, but the calculation itself is unchanged. And wherever the calculation produces the answer that risk is cheaper than safety, the lock appears. It may not be brass. It may not be physical. It may be an algorithm that routes workers away from exits during peak hours. It may be a policy that requires badge in but not badge out. It may be an architecture that places break rooms on the opposite side of the building from the emergency exits. It may be a staffing model that reduces the number of safety officers to save payroll costs. It may be an inspection schedule that visits high-risk facilities once every 5 years instead of once every 5 months. The lock takes many forms. The arithmetic takes only one. 2010. 29 workers at the Upper Big Branch mine in West Virginia lost their lives in a methane explosion. Investigators found that the mine's ventilation system had been deliberately manipulated to pass inspections while allowing dangerous levels of methane to accumulate during normal operations. The mine had received hundreds of safety citations in the years preceding the disaster. The fines for those citations totaled less than the cost of the equipment upgrades that would have prevented the explosion. 2012. 255 workers at the Ali Enterprises garment factory in Karachi, Pakistan. The exits were locked. The windows were barred. The building had no fire escapes, no sprinkler system, no fire alarm. The factory had received a safety certification from a European auditing firm 4 weeks before the fire. The certification was fraudulent. The auditing firm had not visited the factory. 2013. 1,134 workers at Rana Plaza in Savar, Bangladesh. The building had been constructed with substandard materials. Additional floors had been added illegally. Cracks had been discovered in the columns the day before the collapse. Workers had been ordered to return. 2020. 6 warehouse workers at a fulfillment center in the American Midwest were unable to evacuate during a severe weather event because the emergency exit protocol required supervisor approval. The supervisors were in a different section of the building. The workers sheltered in a bathroom. The building sustained structural damage. The workers survived, but the investigation revealed that the exit protocol had been in place for years and had never been reviewed for emergency adequacy. Each of these events is a triangle fire. Each of these events features the same elements: a known risk, an economic calculation, an inadequate safety system, a regulatory failure, and a human cost that exceeds by orders of magnitude the cost of prevention. The brass lock on the shelf in the museum on Spring Street is not a relic. It is a prototype. It is the first draft of a device that has been refined and updated and reimagined for more than a century, but has never been redesigned. The fundamental mechanism is identical. It prevents people from leaving when leaving would cost the business time or money. I want to close with a moment, not a statistic, not a law, not a principle, a moment. It is approximately 4:45 on the afternoon of March 25, 1911. The fire has been burning for about 5 minutes. The 9th floor of the Ash building is filling with smoke. The temperature is rising. The sewing machines are silent. The women who are sitting at those machines are on their feet, moving in every direction, looking for a way out. In the middle of the floor, there is a woman. I do not know her name. None of the accounts identify her. She is described only by what she does. She stops. In the middle of the panic, In the middle of the smoke, she stops. She turns around. She walks back to her sewing machine. She picks up her coat and her hat from the back of her chair. She puts on her coat. She puts on her hat. She adjusts her hat. Then she turns and walks toward the Green Street stairwell. A survivor who witnessed this later said she could not understand it. Why would someone stop to put on a coat and a hat when the building was on fire? But I think I understand it. I think the woman with the coat and the hat was asserting something. I think she was asserting that she was not cargo. She was not inventory. She was not a unit of production valued at 5 minutes per shift. She was a person who wore a coat and a hat, and she was going to leave this building the way a person leaves a building, dressed and composed, and not the way the building wanted her to leave, which was not at all. I do not know if the woman with the coat and the hat survived. The accounts do not say. She walked toward the Green Street stairwell. The Green Street stairwell was passable. It is possible that she made it down. It is possible that she did not. I choose to believe that she did. I choose to believe that she walked down 9 flights of stairs in her coat and her hat, and stepped out onto Green Street and kept walking and never went back. I choose to believe this because the alternative is that she put on her coat and her hat and adjusted her hat and walked into the smoke and was found days later by a fireman who did not know her name. Either way, she chose how she moved through that room. The lock chose whether she left it, but the lock did not choose how she carried herself within it. That was hers. That was the one thing the lock could not take. My name is Blackwell. There is a small brass lock in a museum in New York. It is not behind glass. It sits on a plain wooden shelf. It weighs less than a pound. It held a door shut on the afternoon of March 25, 1911, while 146 people needed that door to open. The lock did its job. The door did not open. The laws changed. The codes changed. The inspections changed. The arithmetic did not change. The lock is still there. And somewhere, right now, someone is doing the math. $75 per life, 5 minutes per worker per shift, 11 cents for the lock. Check the door. Check it now. Make sure it opens from the inside. 146 people are asking you to check. The lock is still there. And so is the arithmetic. Locked in a room or locked in a glowing death. Next time, we meet the women who painted radium onto watch dials with brushes they pointed with their lips. A medicine that cured everything. A miracle element that glowed in the dark. A company that knew. And women whose bones became evidence that could not be buried, could not be hidden, could not be silenced, because the evidence glowed. Next time, the Radium Girls.